First of all, I wanted to thank you very much for inviting me in this lecture series. I feel very honored and I'm very happy to be here. I just want to specify that I'm not a professor, but I'm a doctor. And indeed, my research is on corrupt behavior. And today I'm going to talk to you about inequality and corruption. So I will structure my talk as follows. So I will first explore the relation between corruption and inequality, and then go through some evidence from the literature, and then turn to experimental methodology and try to see if fairness concerns might help to play a role in corrupt decision-making. And for this, I will review two studies that I conducted with co-authors and present you the results. So to start with, and to structure the talk, corruption and inequality are two topics that people feel very passionate about. I think that most people have a story to tell about one of the two, and they are also topics that are closely associated with each other. Here, I'm going to focus on corruption that leads to inequality, even though in some cases you could argue that inequality can also lead to corruption. Okay, but here we'll focus on that aspect. And I copied here two quotes. The first one is from a UNODC representative and says, "Bribery accepted is fairness declined." And the more recent one from Transparency International, the global NGO fighting against corruption, reads, "Corruption leads to an unequal distribution of power in society, which in turn translates into an unequal distribution of wealth and opportunity, feeding the risk of popular discontent and probably stimulating a vicious circle of corruption and inequality." So these are quotes from institutions and civil society, but you can also find in the literature, in the academic literature, evidence to support this claim, and studies exploring this positive relationship between corruption and inequality. Here I'm going to name just a few, but there are more literature, of course. I wanted to first look at Gupta and co-authors, who are one of the first to empirically address this issue. And they conclude that corruption excludes the poor from public services and skew growth. And I took here one graph from their studies, where you can see that on the x-axis you have corruption perception indexes, and on the y-axis you have the Gini coefficient that measures income inequality, and you can see that there is a positive relationship between the two. Okay? In their paper, they also argue that corruption leads to poverty income reduction, and so that's one that's their main claim in the paper. We also have Gyima and Brempong, who get similar results in a different in the African context. So Gupta and al. Was a cross-country of over 17 years, cross-country regressions, and Gyima and Brempong focus only on Africa with several countries, but they get similar results. Another study, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but more recent by Olken in Indonesia, studies how a rice distribution program in different villages in Indonesia, in order to try to improve distribution, was damaged by corruption. And so when corruption occurs, we can see that the redistribution effort is completely damaged, and welfare overall is also damaged. In an empirical study, Hunt and Laszlo, using survey data for Peru and Uganda, see that, so they have reported measures of corruption and measures of outcome. And what they observe is that even though public officials try to angle for the higher bribe, so the bribe from the richer citizen, it is the poorest citizen who bear the burden in terms of this utility. So they still suffer more than wealthier citizens. And finally, two studies here, Justesen and Bjornskov and Fried Lagunes and Venkataramani, show that corruption leads to the poor citizens being victims of street-level bureaucrats. So here in Justesen and Bjornskov study, it's mostly empirical data. It's based on the Afrobarometer, and they have 18 countries. And I just show you, don't get scared, it's just this line that is interesting for us, just shows you that corruption is positively correlated with poverty, okay? And their study is quite detailed, and they argue that the poor suffer more from street-level corruption because they actually have less exit options than wealthier citizens. So while to benefit from public services, wealthier citizens can turn to maybe private sector, poorest people can only rely on the public service for, let's say, medical purposes or education. So they are more likely to suffer from corruption. Another study that I wanted to share with you here, confirms these results, but using another methodology. Fried Lagunes and Venkataramani here use a sort of natural study, and they actually drive cars in the traffic of Mexico City. So what they do is they drive a car, and there is a traffic violation that is not too bad, but still that is illegal, which is turning left when it's actually not allowed. Okay, and they have a police officer. They know there's a police officer right here trying to deal with traffic. And what they do is they have two types of cars. They have a big car with a wealthy-looking driver, and they have cheaper cars with a poor-looking guy driving the car. And what they're interested in is to see how will the police officer handle the situation. So, I mean, doing exactly the same traffic violation, what will happen to the driver? What will the interaction be with the police officer? And what they observe is that, first of all, poor and rich drivers are equally likely to get stopped. Okay, so that's the first thing. Then, when they're actually stopped, none of them are issued an official ticket for their traffic violation. None of them. However, and that's where the difference is, the poor-looking driver were asked for a bribe, while the rich-looking drivers usually got a warning and got away with it, were ordered to continue on the road. Okay, so that result was a bit puzzling to those researchers, and they conducted qualitative interviews with police officers after this exercise to understand more about the incentives, the motives for this behavior. And police officers actually confirmed that this was a rational thing to do as a police officer in Mexico. Of course, it depends a lot on context, but as a public official with a low salary, they were happy to complement their salary with a bribe. And by fear of retaliation, they wouldn't fine rich-looking drivers because they were too scared of the consequences. Okay, so in the end, and that's what we had as a result previously, it leads the poor to be victims more often of street-level bureaucrats. Okay, so that's a part of the literature, I mean, some studies that I wanted to show you, just to illustrate this positive correlation between corruption and inequality. Now I would like to turn to experimental methodology. And I think experimental methodology is really useful to understand corrupt behavior and corrupt decision-making. So first, working with data when working on corruption is very difficult because of the very nature of corruption. Nobody has an incentive to disclose if they engage in a corrupt transaction. And what we mostly use is perception data or reported measures of corruption. And both can suffer either from a perception bias or from a reporting bias. So we know from a study by Olken that very often reported measures of corruption are very different from actual levels of corruption. And getting real data about corruption is possible. Some people have done it. It's usually very large and costly projects because it involves to track money, and it really you really need a lot of information, and it requires time and collaboration from an industry, for example, to help you. So it might be handy to be able to produce your own data, and that's one thing you can do in the lab. Okay? So what experimental economists have done is they have developed bribery games that can be played in the lab. So it's actually participants who come to play to a game, but in the game there is a temptation for to get more money at the expense of other people, and that represents corruption. Okay? So people come and play a game, they can earn more money if they accept the bribery temptation. Okay? It's supposed to mimic real life. Of course, it's not perfect because it's experimental, but still, it can teach us a few things, and it can also, in the lab, we can control things, so we can play with some parameters that will vary, you know, in the context of your game, and maybe teach us something about the mechanism of corrupt decision-making. So I wanted to show you, related on this, the results of a few experimental bribery games. So you can do many things in a bribery game. You can, as I said, vary a lot of parameters. You can have context, or it can be completely abstract. You can have different type of players. You can have a probability of getting caught. You can have a sanction. You can have a repeated game where people, you know, play several sessions after the other. You can have, you name it. I mean, you can really have different design features. But here, I want to show you the results of different bribery games that have a few features in common. And these features are, they are one shot, so not repeated. Participants play only once. They are anonymous. So as a participant, I don't know how other people in the room are playing, and I know that other people in the room don't know how I play. Okay, so it's anonymous, and my name is not displayed. I'm isolated in making my decisions, so no risk of being disclosed. And also no risk of sanction. So even though the experimenter might know what you're doing, if you're accepting a bribe, there's no risk of sanction. And people know it. And we see that in this case, bribe taking is high. Maybe not very surprising. And I'm just showing you a few examples. Here, it's a study by Frank and Schulz. It's actually one of the very first bribery game that was conducted in Germany with students. And the way to read this graph is that on the left-hand side, you have the proportion of students who did not accept a bribe in the game. So it's 12%, so we end up with a 88% level of bribe taking. Okay. This is another study that I conducted actually with a co-author in Burundi. This time it was with public servants. And the way to read this graph is actually the same. And by pure coincidence, we end up with the same figure of 88% of bribe-taking level. So it means those guys here refused to take a bribe, even though it was anonymous, even though there was no reciprocal mechanism that could be, that could take place because it was one shot, and there was no risk of sanction. And I'm just showing you another study that was conducted in Oxford University with students from different nationality by Barr and Sierra. And here the way to read this graph is a bit different because they put the no bribe option at the end of the graph, but still what you can see is that 75% to 90% of their students did take a bribe. And here you have different colors for different treatments, but we don't pay attention to this in this context. So bribe-taking is high, given the conditions that I told you earlier. And probably as a policymaker, the objective would be how to reduce this high level of bribe-taking. How can I, try to have, if we assume that corruption is bad, and let's assume that it's bad, how can we reduce this level of bribe-taking? And there are many ways to do that, actually, and it has been tested in the lab as well. Many are very efficient, like monitoring people, like the risk of a sanction, like the reputational risk, like your identity being disclosed to other participants. Incentives as well, like financial incentives, better pay people in order to lower their bribery acceptance rates. Also, you could have institutional designs like staff rotation, so people rotate in terms of partnership, so they are not, they don't keep playing with each other, and it's harder to have like a relationship where people, get used to exchanging bribes and favors. So different solutions, but those are usually costly and they're sometimes complicated to implement. It's interesting to try in the lab to find other cheaper ways of trying to reduce this bribe-taking level. And actually, what I tried to do in 2 studies with co-authors. And one of the things that interested us was to see if fairness concerns, so the preference for fairness that people have as an innate preference, might play a role in corrupt decision-making. So in general, we know that people have a preference for fairness. So they prefer the fair outcome. Fer and Schmidt have shown it in a theory, but also with experiments, and Knauer has confirmed it later. And we also know that it's not just the fair outcome for other people, it's also that some people are ready to give up some money to enforce fairness or to obtain a more fair situation. So we thought, okay, maybe fairness preferences may be useful in trying to lower this bribe-taking level. And I mean, it has to be discussed in practice how exactly, but we could think that maybe reduced bribe-taking in street-level bureaucracies would be possible. And what would be important is to make it salient to the public official what his decisions actually have as a consequence in terms of inequality. So it's still a bit theoretical, I agree, and in practice, you will have to imagine how it can really take place, depending on the context. It always depends on the context, of course. But that's the idea behind the research that the 2 studies that I'm going to show you now, that are experimental. So the first one was conducted with my co-author Jean-Benoît Fallis, who was in Oxford at the time, and he's now in Edinburgh. And we were in Burundi, and we organized a lab in the field experiment. So as you can see from the picture behind. We invited people to play to a game, and we have a handmade lab with cardboard boxes where people are isolated and they can actually make their decision, in private. And that's the anonymity feature of our game. And the topic of the study was corruption awareness and public service delivery. So we told these people, imagine you're a public servant, which was easy because they were actually public servants in real life. And we told them, as a public servant, you have to deliver a public service. And here, I'm going to explain the experimental design. If you have a question about detail or you don't follow, you can ask me a question if it's not too long. So we tell them, you're a public servant, you have to distribute a public service, and for this we give you 12 vouchers representing the public service. So it's limited in quantity, it's only 12. And you have to satisfy the needs of 3 citizens. And they equally deserve this basic public service. So what we are interested in is, the first objective was to try to increase moral costs with anti-corruption messages, with a control group and other groups, but I'm not going to go into this right now because it's not really the focus, and I can explain to you later. But also another objective was that to observe their behavior in terms of bribe taking, because there will be bribery involved in the design, but also their behavior in terms of fairness in the public service delivery, so how they distribute those vouchers. That's the 2 things that we observe. So they had their vouchers, and they received from the citizens envelopes with requests for the vouchers and money to go with it, because the voucher had a price. And there are 3 citizens, so there are 3 envelopes. Normally, the citizen asks for 4 vouchers, which is normal. But one of the citizens, and that's the big envelope here with the red thing around, one citizen is trying to corrupt them. And he's asking for more of the public service. And to convince the public servant that he should get it, he puts a lot more money in the envelope too. Okay, so the money was actually fake photocopy of banknotes that we told participants would be exchanged against real money at the end of the experiment. Do you follow me? Yeah? So we wanted to see, okay, what will public servants do? How will they distribute the vouchers? And also, what will they do with the money? There were several things that they could do. If they were being perfect public servants, they would distribute equally, 4 to each, and only take the money corresponding to the vouchers, leaving extra money in the envelope. But they also had the possibility to give more vouchers to the briber and take the bribe, and then give less vouchers to the others, okay? Because if you give more to one, since you have only 12, it leaves less for the others. So there you would be unfair and corrupt, okay? While when you were perfect, you were fair and uncorrupt. But one thing that we allowed also in the game is that they could be fair, give 4 to each, but take the bribe and take all of the money that was available in the envelope. And that's something that was allowed and not sanctioned. And that was also a possibility. And as a result, I'm telling you exactly how to read this graph, we see that the larger the circle is, the more frequent is the result. So as a result here, we see that most people took the maximum bribe, but were fair in their voucher distribution. Okay, so here actually, so if you go from 0 to the right, people are more unfair, and here if you go from 0 to the top, you take more bribe, you're more corrupt. Okay, so the larger the circle is where people are, they take the maximum bribe amount, but they are fair. Here, this circle here that is also, smaller but large also is perfect civil servants. So they don't take any bribe and they distribute equally. And there, all the rest is between is people being reciprocal to the briber and maybe not daring to take all of the money, etc. Okay? So, to sum up, most participants take the maximum bribe amount, which is not surprising because, I mean, they were not punished to do so. It was allowed, right? I mean, there was no mechanism that... But it's interesting because most of them treated citizens equally. So they didn't have to do that. I mean, they felt they had to do it. So we see that, fairness preferences do exist, right? Because they choose to be fair overall. But it's easy because it was not costly, right? You could be fair and take the money too. You could have the cake and eat it too, in a way, okay? So now, would this hold if it was costly for them to be fair? And that's the topic of the next study that I conducted with Lena Epp from Paderborn University, and it was conducted in Germany in a lab. So here the setting was very different because we were in a very controlled environment, very abstract setting, no story behind, just numbers and computers and decisions to make. And we wonder, does caring about fairness impact corrupt decisions? And I put here the structure of the game. So I won't go into details, but just what's important to see here is that this orange arrow here shows us that we're interested in what decisions player B is making. And player B would be the equivalent of our public official in the Burundian game. Okay? And player B will have to make a decision, and he will have to make a decision about player A1 and player A2, two players that can represent the citizens in the Burundian game, even though there were three in the Burundian game, but here only two. But let's say player B is a public official, and player A1 and player A2 are citizens. Again, player B has something to distribute, like a public service, and he has to distribute between the two citizens. Here is the design. Player B here has to distribute something, it's not important what for now, between player A1 and player A2. And what player A1 and player A2 will try to do, because they want to get more of the public service, because they will get more money out of it in the end, they will try to bribe player B to get more of this public service. Okay? What's important is that player B is richer than player A1 or player A2. And whatever the outcomes of the game, he's always richer. We made sure he would always be richer because we didn't want the fairness concerns of B to be himself compared to the citizens. But we wanted him to be like a third part observer, spectator, and trying to enforce fairness, caring or not about fairness between two citizens because he's anyway richer than both. Right? So that's an important feature. Otherwise, it all gets mixed up. It really interferes in the decisions. To mimic the corruption in this very abstract setting, there is a negative externality. As soon as someone, player B, accepts a bribe, there is a negative externality that affects all players in the experimental room. A small one, but still it represents the fact that corruption actually damages institutions and, reduces the money available for the general public. Okay. One important feature here is that player A1 and player A2 try simultaneously to bribe player B, but player B can only choose one bribe. He cannot take both, so he has to choose. And another thing that he can do is reject both. So either he rejects both bribes, either he accepts player A1's bribe or player A2's bribe. Okay, that's what he can do. And in our unfair treatment of the game, player A1 is poor and player A2 is rich. While in the control group, they are both of equal wealth. Okay, so the difference between the control and treatment here is that in the control, there is no unfair initial situation. Both are rich. But in the unfair treatment, there is for no reason a poor citizen and a rich citizen. Okay, and the poor citizen can afford a lower bribe than the richest citizen. Is it okay? Because it's very difficult to explain an experimental design in little time. So do not hesitate if something is not clear. Okay. And here we want to see, okay, what will player B do? Will he be influenced by the fact that he has a rich and a poor citizen, or will he just make exactly the same decision as if he was dealing with two equal wealth citizens, or if he was just blind to it? You know, he didn't know, had no information about it. Here are the results. So here you have the control treatment on the left and the unfair treatment on the right. And let's focus first on the columns, the color of the columns. The blue column is the bribe rejection rate. So when player B decides to reject both bribes, he doesn't want any of them. The yellow column is the low bribe taken, and the red column is the high bribe taken. And first, we can observe that, as with the previous literature, the previous experimental literature, most people in this setting that was also anonymous, also one shot, or also no sanction, people go for the bribe, right? The bribe taking is quite high. And also consistently with the previous literature that we reviewed before, the empirical literature, they mostly go for the high bribe, meaning that this is to the advantage of the richer citizen, because the richer citizen will then benefit from the favor delivered, because the favor is automatically delivered when the bribe is accepted. So having your bribe accepted is good for you because it makes you richer at the end of the game. I'm sorry about not being able to go into more details, but I can send you the paper or discuss it later. So this is consistent so far with the literature. What we observe is that between control and unfair treatment, we have a difference because the bribe rejection rate is higher than in the control. So all other things being equal, just the fact that you witness that you have a poor and a rich citizen in front of you seems to affect your propensity to accept a bribe. And apparently people tend to reject more. They don't feel comfortable. They feel less comfortable. Okay? The difference is significant. And it seems to be at the expense of the high bribe taken. Okay? So here, to sum up, bribes are rejected more when there is a rich versus a poor citizen. And with two simultaneous bribes, the rich briber is accepted less, but the poor briber is not more accepted. And you could think, okay, if my player B cares about fairness, maybe he would want the poor guy to become richer. And by accepting the bribe of the poor guy, he could actually make him richer. So we could have thought, okay, maybe there's some kind of corrective fairness mechanism going on, and he will lower the acceptance of the high bribe, not to increase inequality even more than it was the case initially, but maybe he will try to favor the poor guy and make him richer. And that's not the case. That's not what we observe. And then we observe that in our game, by accepting the bribe of the low guy, you would actually reverse the pre-existing order of wealth between the citizens. Meaning that the citizen that was initially poor, when his bribe is accepted, he becomes richer than the rich citizen. So in a way, you kind of disturb a pre-existing order of wealth. And people seem to be uncomfortable with that. So that's what we could call rank-preserving preferences. It actually exists in the literature when testing distributional preferences. People are eager to redistribute in a fair manner, but they're not comfortable with reversing an existing order. They're averse to reversing a hierarchy. Maybe they don't want to take responsibility for that, even though it brings people closer together to a same level of wealth. So yeah, here we thought, okay, fairness concerns, probably, because we have a difference between the control and the treatment group, but probably more complex than that. And it could be related to this rank-preserving preferences issue. So I'm going to stop here, and I just want to take stock of what has been presented so far. We know that there's a positive correlation between corruption and inequality, and it has been widely established in the literature. And we also know now that fairness preferences might play a role in corrupt decision-making, as we've seen from the two experimental studies that I presented. However, there are crucial elements that have to be also taken into account, and they interact and interfere with fairness preferences. And those are, an example is professional identity or personal identity. So as a public servant, how do I feel, how do I see myself? That's something that I study in the Burindian paper as well. Rank reversal aversion, so that's what I just explained about preferring to stick to the initial order of things and preferring not to reverse it. And also, I didn't have time to talk about it here, but there's this value dilemma about fairness and loyalty. In some groups, fairness is valued, but loyalty is even more important than fairness. And those are often go in different directions. And this has to be taken into account as well. So I hope you liked the presentation, that these topics will stimulate new ideas for research, maybe also for policy. And I'm very curious to have your reactions. Thank you for listening.